G'day everyone, it's good to be here with you all. Hello to those online as well. We've got a lot to get through. Well done getting through that reading, Em. Good job. We're going to be in chapters 18 and 19 of 1 Samuel, so have that open in front of you. That'd be great. My name's Matt. Did I say that? No? You reckon I did? My name's Matt. It's all good. Okay, let's jump in. Let's have a look at it. I want to start today by asking you a question. The question is, what is the response that you have to Jesus? What is the response that you have to Jesus? More specifically, do you love him? Do you love Jesus? Now, we often speak of things like we have our faith in Jesus, or we trust him, or we obey him. Maybe you might even say you fear him. But do you love Jesus? There was a question that Jesus asked his most inner disciple, Peter, after he'd risen from the dead. Peter and Jesus were sitting on the Sea of Galilee eating breakfast, and Peter turns to him and 3 times asks him, Peter, do you love me? After all, it's the first and the greatest commandment, isn't it? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. Do you love Jesus? And what does it look like to love Jesus? Is it just a warm, fuzzy feeling you get when you're singing to Jesus? Or is it something more than just that? Well, listen to how Jesus himself puts it in Matthew chapter 10. He says it this way, he says, anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. That's so much more than a warm, fuzzy feeling, isn't it? Jesus says you need to love me more than you love anyone else. But then he even ups the commitment more in the very next verse. He says, whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. What Jesus is asking of us is for our whole life, to be willing to lay aside whatever it is that we're living for and to live for him instead. But the promise, he says, that if you do that, you will not only lose your old life, but you'll gain real life, a new life. And so do you love Jesus like that? Because that's not a Jesus that you can sort of pray a prayer to when you're a teenager or something and then sort of put him up on the shelf until you need him later on in life or when something bad happens. He wants your whole life. He wants your heart. Now, we're in this series. We've been working our way through the book of 1 Samuel, and today we get to chapters 18 and 19. And in these passages, I don't know if you noticed it, but what we get is 2 distinct and contrasting responses to David. Now, what we found out so far as been working through 1 Samuel is that David is God's chosen and anointed king. And so in this passage, we can learn a lot about what it means for us to respond to God's king. Now, really today, the structure is going to be pretty simple. Throughout these 2 chapters, there's 6 accounts that we are given. And so we're just going to work our way through them one by one. And then at the end, I want to return back to this question of how it is that we should be responding to God's king. So let's jump in. Now, just to get us up to speed, if you haven't been here or if you've been away, what we've seen so far is King Saul has been rejected as God's king because of his disobedience. And instead, David has been anointed as a new king to replace Saul. Now, Saul doesn't know this at the moment. He knows that he's been rejected, but he doesn't know that it's going to be David who's going to be king instead of him. And then last week we saw David make this big entry onto the scene with the whole story of David and Goliath. David kills Goliath, and then the Israelite army comes through and wipes out the Philistine army. And then chapter 17 ends with King Saul inviting this young shepherd boy David to come and speak with him. And that's where we jump into our passage for today. So, like I said, it'd be good to have that open in front of you. It'll come up on the screen as well, but it's always better if you've got a Bible open in front of you. So let's go. Let's start in chapter 18. Now, right from the start, we're given 2 contrasting responses to David. The first one is to take, and then the second one is to give. So let's first look at King Saul and his response to David. Verse 2 it says, "From that day Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family." Now the word here is the word took. If you've got an ESV translation, that's what it will say, keep, took. It's the same thing. The reason I highlight the word took is because if you go back a few chapters to chapter 8, this is what Samuel the prophet said about this king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots." Or moreover, in chapter 14, it said, "Whenever Saul saw a mighty or brave man, he took him into his service." And so Saul responds to seeing what David had done with Goliath by taking him and using him to fight his battles for him. Now remember, that was Saul's job. He was the king that was given. They'd asked for a king who would go out before them and fight their battles. That was Saul's job. He was the one who was a foot taller than everyone else, and he was the one who should have gone out and fought this giant Goliath. But what he didn't do, what the army didn't do, David did. And so his response to him is to take him and to use him for himself. That's the first response. The contrasting response then comes from Saul's son, Jonathan. He was the heir to the throne. He was the oldest son. He would have been heir to the throne after his father Saul. This is what it says about Jonathan. Verse 1, it says, "Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself." Now, what does it mean that he loved him as himself? Well, we're told in verse 3, it says, "And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him." What's the covenant? Well, it says Jonathan took off his robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Okay, what's going on here? What is happening here? Well, firstly, let me tell you what isn't happening here. This isn't the start of some sort of sexual relationship between Jonathan and David, as if this is some sort of striptease or something like that. That's not what's going on here. To suggest that that is the case, and many have, I think says more about our current culture that is overly sexualized than it does about what's actually happening here in the story. Moreover, as you keep reading through this text, you might have noticed it as Em read it out. It's not just Jonathan that loves David. Everyone loves David. His attendants, his daughter, even all Israel and Judah loved David. The point of these chapters is everyone loves David. Well, nearly everyone. So what is happening here? Well, here you have Jonathan, the heir to the throne, who has just witnessed David going out and fighting their battles on their behalf, and he acknowledges it by taking off his royal robe and his weapons and giving them to David. What he's saying as he derobes himself is, "I'm not the king, you are. You're the one who is going to go out and fight our battles for us." Now that's a pretty humbling thing for the king's son to do, isn't it? But just in case you're not convinced, if you zoom out from this first story to see these two chapters as one unit, they start and they end with a very similar story that starts with the derobing of Jonathan, and at the end we'll see it finishes with another derobing. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, so we'll come back to that at the end. But what we have here right at the start, and this is going to set the scene for these next two chapters, is these two contrasting responses to David. Saul sees David and takes him for himself, whereas Jonathan sees this future king, takes off his own robes and gives them to him. That's the first account you see in the first 5 verses. The second account comes in verses 6 to 16. And it doesn't take long for things to escalate from there. So verse 6, "When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing. With joyful songs and with timbrels and lyres they danced and they sang, 'Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands.'" Now, it's just a song, and it doesn't really even make sense when you think about it. How many people has David killed at this stage? One person. And yet they're contributing to him tens of thousands, whereas Saul has only killed thousands, and Saul's not happy about it. In fact, he's angry. It says Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him. They have credited to David tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? And from that time on, Saul kept a close eye on David. Now, Saul was jealous. He was jealous of the credit that David was getting, but I think it's more than that. Did you notice the question that he asks himself? What more can he get but the kingdom? Now, Saul knew that God had rejected him, but he was trying to hold on to that kingdom, and it seems like he's starting to piece it together. Maybe this is the guy who's going to take the kingdom. And so what he's really angry about is his kingdom is being threatened here. And so it says David keeps a close eye on him. And it doesn't take long to see what exactly his plans are for David. So verse 10 says, the very next day, an evil spirit from God came forcefully on Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Now, it might be that David just wasn't really good at playing the instrument and he just got sick of it and threw the spear. Don't think that's what's happening. This is the first time we get reference to this evil spirit. Now, I'm going to come back to that later on because I'm sure you'll have questions, particularly if you've been in a community group this week. You probably had a whole bunch of questions to do with this. But for now, note that he's trying to kill David. 2 times he throws a spear at him, and both times David manages to elude him. And so when that doesn't work, Saul goes to plan B. He decides to send him off to war. Now, we're not told here, but later on we're told the reason why he does that is to get, hopefully, David killed while he's off in battle. And so verse 14, the problem is, in everything that he did, that is David, he had great success. Why? It was because the Lord was with him. He used to be with Saul. Now, the Lord has departed from Saul and is now with him. So he has great success. And so the plan backfires. Not only does he not die when he goes out to war, but he's successful in everything that he does, exactly what the king is meant to do. He's the one going out and fighting the battles. And the reason is because the Lord is with him and not Saul. And so again, we have these responses. Verse 15. When Saul saw how successful he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he led them in their campaigns. 2 contrasting responses to David. Saul's afraid because he's challenging his kingdom. The people love him because he's going out and fighting their battles and being successful. Okay, third account. You see this in verses 17 to 30, and Saul tries a new approach this time. Now, back in chapter 17, verse 25, we read this. It says, the king will give great wealth to the man who kills Goliath. He'll also give his daughter in marriage and will exempt his family from paying taxes in Israel. Pretty good benefits if you can kill Goliath. Now, clearly Saul hasn't come good on his promise. And so I guess here he decides, okay, maybe I should do something about that. Well, sort of. So verse 17, Saul said to David, here is my older daughter, Merab. I will give her to you in marriage. But comes with a condition. It says, only serve me bravely and fight the battles of the Lord. But we get more information. The narrator tells us what's really going on here. The end of verse 17 says, for Saul said to himself, I will not raise a hand against him. Let the Philistines do that for him. Now, it's not a bad plan, is it? Send him off to war as the king's son-in-law. That's got to put a big target on his back. Maybe the Philistines will go after him and kill him. But David's response, have a look what his response is to this. But David said to Saul, Who am I, and who is my family or my clan in Israel that I should become the king's son-in-law? Now, it's hard to say if he's being humble here or if he's caught wind of what this plan could be. But in the end, when the time came for Merab to marry David, she gets given to someone else instead. But there's a lucky break for Saul, because Saul has another daughter, and he finds out that, like everyone else, she loves David. And so, verse 21, I will give her to him, he thought, so that she may be a snare to him, and so that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So same plan, different daughter. But this time he's learned he needs to do a bit of matchmaking, and so he sends his attendants to speak to him. And so verse 22, then Saul ordered his attendants, speak to David privately and say, look, the king likes you, and his attendants all love you. Now become his son-in-law. But David responds the same way as he did the first time. He says, do you think it is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known. It's almost like a bit of a dig. You're meant to make me wealthy and you haven't even given me a cent. But really what he's saying is, how could I become the king's son-in-law? I could never pay the bride price for the king to have his daughter. Well, David, it's your lucky day, because Saul's got a deal for you. Now, I have to warn you all now, this is where it starts to get a little bit weird. So, hold on. Verse 25. The king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on all his enemies. Now, I love how he speaks about this as if it's just a small price, going out, killing 100 men, and then after you've killed them, circumcise them, and then go and collect all the foreskins and bring them back to me, and you can have my daughter. That's it. Now, again, we are told more information. We get the real motive behind what Saul's doing here. It says Saul's plan was to have David fall by the hands of the Philistines. And you've got to admit, out of all the plans he's had so far, this is probably the best one. First of all, if he's going to go and kill 100 Philistines, maybe he'll be the one who's killed in that process. But even if he does manage to do it, you can just imagine the target he's going to have on his back. He's come into their camp and killed 100 Philistines, and he did what? What did he do to our men? That's got to make them pretty mad, right? But again, Saul's plan backfires. Verse 26. When the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. So before the allotted time elapsed, David took his men with him and went out and killed not 100 but 200 Philistines and brought back their foreskins. They counted out the full number to the king so that David might become the king's son-in-law. Now you can just imagine the scene. You probably shouldn't imagine the scene, but you can imagine it. David comes home and he's like, hey, Saul, remember that bride price you asked for? Here it is. And then some poor guy has to, count them out one by one. And he gets to 100, but there's still heaps left. And he keeps counting, gets to 200. And so Saul had no choice but to give his daughter in marriage to David. Once again, his plan to kill David was cut short. No one got it. That's good. Verse 28. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and that his daughter Michal loved David, Saul became still more afraid of him, and he remained his enemy the rest of his days. And so Saul could see that the Lord was with David instead of him. He could see that his daughter loved David instead of him. Again, we're getting these two contrasting responses. One was to love David, one was to become his enemy. That's the first three accounts. You still with me? One person's with me. I'll take it. That's good. Okay, now the fourth account here comes in chapter 19, 1 to 7. And as we move into this second chapter, Saul steps up his attack. He's no longer trying to hide the fact that he's wanting to kill David. It's out in the open now. He's a big threat to his kingdom. He wants him dead. And so verse 1, Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David. But there's just one problem. Because we already know back in chapter 18, both Jonathan and all the attendants love David. And so Jonathan goes and warns David about this plan, but more than that, he speaks to his father on behalf of him. And so verse 4, Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul, his father, and said to him, "Let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life into his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason?" Now, they're all really good points, aren't they? And what's even more surprising is that Saul listens to his son. And so verse 6, he took an oath. "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death." And so Jonathan brings David back into the palace. It's all happy families again. But I'm not sure if we're meant to believe this after everything that's happened so far. Well, the fifth account happens in verses 8 to 17. And the next thing we're told is that war breaks out again between Israel and the Philistines. But it's not Saul that goes out to fight the battle with the army, it's David. So verse 8, David went out and fought the Philistines, and he struck them with such force that they fled from him. But an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear. Now, this is the second time we've had this phrase, this evil spirit coming upon Saul. It's a harmful spirit if you've got an ESV translation. You also see it back in chapter 16. Tim somehow managed to dodge that last week when he spoke to us from that passage. And so let's pause for a second. Let's try and figure out what is going on here. What's going on with this evil spirit? As a heads up to set expectations, I'm not sure if I'm going to give you every answer that you want to this, but let's see what we can come up with. And maybe if you've still got questions, you can come and see me afterwards. But let me say a few things. Now, back in chapter 16, what we saw is that David was anointed as king. And when he was anointed as king, the Spirit of God came upon him. But at the same time, the Spirit of God was taken from Saul. And it was replaced with this evil or this harmful spirit. But secondly, it also appears that God sends this evil or harmful spirit in judgment for Saul's disobedience. Thirdly, I don't think that we're meant to understand spirit here as demon or something like that, but more like a period of mental or emotional disturbance that would come upon him at different times. The word spirit has a much broader range of meaning than just demon. Think more like a spirit of bitterness than a demon. Fourthly, every time it's mentioned, it comes upon Saul for a time, but then it is removed from him. And it's also worth noting that only 2 times in this story, when I think there's been 6 or 7 attempts at David's life, it's only 2 of those times is there mention of the evil spirit. All the other times, there's no mention of the evil spirit having anything to do with his actions. And so I don't think you could blame this evil spirit for the actions that Saul takes to try and kill David. So what's going on? Well, here's my best attempt at understanding it. My best guess is that Saul had some sort of mental condition that at different times would overcome him and cause him to lash out in violent outbursts. You'll notice that each time the Spirit comes upon him, he ends up throwing a spear at David. And also that this comes upon him as a judgment from God. All cleared up? Maybe, maybe not. If you've still got questions, come and see me later or keep digging into it with other people. As I read through the commentaries this week, that's about as much clarity as I could get on it. Okay, with all that to say, let's keep moving. Well, what happens next? Well, verse 10 says, David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall, and that night David made good his escape. Actually, what it says there is that David fled. Now remember, it was just before that as David led the army, he attacked them with such force that the Philistines fled. But now here it's David that flees. Now I don't think it's because he's afraid of Saul or couldn't even overpower Saul. I think you start to get a glimpse here of David's character, that he's not going to lift his hand against the Anointed One. You see that in the coming chapters, we're going to see that I think 3 more times David has an opportunity to kill Saul, but he doesn't take it. Well, verse 11 says, Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, if you do not run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. And so Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. Now once again, it's someone from Saul's own family, this time his daughter, that helps David escape and foils his plan. And that's where we come to the last account in these chapters. Hang in there, we're going well. Okay, the last account comes in verses 18 to 24. Now, when David flees, he goes off to the prophet Samuel. Now, you'll remember Samuel is the one who had anointed David as king in chapter 16. Now, David's whereabouts gets back to Saul, and so he sends a group of men to capture him. However, when they arrive, things don't go quite to plan again. So verse 20 says, but when they saw a group of prophets prophesying, with Samuel standing there as their leader, the Spirit of God came on Saul's men, and they also prophesied. Saul was told about it, and he sent some more men, and they prophesied too. Saul sent men a 3rd time, and they also prophesied. Now, the word prophesied here is a little bit confusing because there's 2 meanings that it can have. In the Hebrew, there's 2 stems of this word. Now, one of them is used for Samuel and the prophets, and when it's used for them, it means speaking the words of God. But this other stem meaning of the word prophecy, which is always used of Saul and his men, means more something like raving, and some of the translations will have the word raving. Think like a raving lunatic. So there's a very big difference between what's going on here. And so Saul sends 3 separate groups to capture David, and all 3 groups end up raving like lunatics, not being able to capture David as they were told to do. And so Saul gets jack of this and he decides to go himself. But when he arrives, the Spirit of God came even on him, and he walked along prophesying, as in the word raving, until he came to Naioth. He stripped off his garments, and he too prophesied, that's raved again, in Samuel's presence. He lay naked all that day and all that night. This is why the people say, is Saul among the prophets? Now, they're being sarcastic there. They don't actually think he's a prophet. They're mocking him as they do this, like they did right at the start as well. And so this chapter, well, these chapters end with Saul's plan to kill David completely failing, and him laying on the ground naked, raving like a lunatic. Now remember I said at the start that these chapters start and end in the same way. Chapter 18 started with Jonathan, who was the heir to the throne, the next in line, willingly taking off his robe, his royal clothes and armor, and giving that to David, acknowledging that he was the king. Whereas chapter 19 ends with the Spirit of God preventing Saul from capturing David, and instead he is stripped naked, laying on the floor, raving like a lunatic. God prevents Saul from capturing and killing David, and he's completely stripped naked. All of his attempts to kill David have been foiled. His own family, his children have conspired against him. Even the Spirit of God intervenes here at the end to prevent any of his plans succeeding, whereas everything David does succeeds. And even he has to admit that David has the Spirit of God in him and he does not anymore. That's our passage. And so what I want to do as we end is to go back to that question that I had at the start. The question of, how is it that you respond to Jesus? What is your response to him? Because what we get in these 2 chapters we've just looked at is these 2 opposing, contrasting responses to God's anointed king. Now, in our passage, it's David, isn't it? But David points forward as you work our way through the Bible to God's ultimate king, the one who was born in Bethlehem, the one who came from the family and the line of David, the son of David, Jesus, God's true anointed king who sits on the throne and rules forever. And so how we respond to that king, to King Jesus, really does matter right now. And so there's two options. Will you oppose him? Bless you. Will you oppose him because he's trying to challenge your rule over your own life? Do you want to hold on to that and keep it for yourself? Do you want to hold on to your own power and your own little kingdom? Because if that's you, like Saul, you'll end up being found spiritually naked. Or will you, like Jonathan, humbly take off your robes, spiritually speaking, and give them to the true King, to Jesus? That's the response that he deserves. And that's what it looks like to love him. Now, I suspect that for many of us here, we would say, yeah, I love Jesus. I follow Jesus. If that's you, I just want to push a little bit deeper into this. Because remember what Jesus said back in Matthew 10? He said, anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. So my question is, do you love Jesus like that? Is he more important to you than anything else, than anyone else? Because that's what it means to love Jesus. To give all that you have to him. Not just parts of your life, but every part of your life. Everyone in your life. And not just to do that one day, but to do it every day for the rest of your life. That's what it looks like to follow Jesus, to love Jesus. It's a humbling thing to do, isn't it? To give up your own rule of your own life and to give it over to Jesus. But he's the true king. He deserves it. But he's also the king who goes out and fights our battles for us on our behalf. The king who loves us. And so what other response could we have but to love him and to give our life to him? And so let's pray that God would do that in our lives. He doesn't just want our words, he wants our hearts, doesn't he? So let's pray. God, we thank you for King Jesus. We thank you that he is the one who is seated on your throne, that David was just a shadow of your true king who would come. Father, we pray that we would honor him as king, that we would take the robes off ourselves and give them to him as an expression of love, that this would not be something we've done in the past, but it would be something that we do every day, that we would humbly give up our own rule and our own kingdom and give it over to Jesus, the one in whom every knee will bow and every tongue confess that he is Lord. We pray this in his name. Amen.